Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Special Projects Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to Moment Happy Hour for today's Zoominar, Discovering Your Family Secrets with Esther Safran Foer and Robert Siegel. Please note that today's conversation is being recorded and will be posted later this week. Towards the end of the session, we will open it up for Q&A, so please type your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find on your screen. After today's program, you can find articles related to the Holocaust on our website at momentmag.com. While you're on the website, we also ask that you consider making a donation to help support our ongoing effort to bring you new and engaging opportunities like today's conversation. We also hope you consider subscribing to the magazine. Finally, please join us in 2 weeks on Tuesday, June 30th for our next Zoominar with World War Z author Max Brooks, who will join us to discuss his new book, Devolution. Now for today's conversation, Discovering Your Family Secrets, with two people who are very dear to Moment. I'd first like to introduce Moment Advisory Board member Esther Safran Foer. For 10 years, Esther was the executive director and CEO of Six and I, a center for arts and entertainment, as well as a synagogue, where she led the creation of what the national media calls a new paradigm for Jewish life. Esther has been recognized as one of the Forward 50 Jewish leaders in the country and was named one of the most powerful women in Washington. Esther and her husband, Bert, are the proud parents of 3 best-selling authors, Frank, Jonathan, and Joshua Foer, as well as the grandparents of 6 grandchildren. Esther is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she is currently on tour for her first book, I Want You to Know We're Still Here, a post-Holocaust memoir. Esther will be joined in conversation today with Moment special contributor Robert Siegel. For 30 years, Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening magazine, All Things Considered. In 2008, Robert was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism. He has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Robert is a dear friend of Esther's, and I know he is looking forward to interviewing her today. So please welcome Esther Foer and Robert Siegel.
There are, I think, many families, literary families, in which more than one member or more than one generation has written about the same general story. What's unusual about the Foer family is that Esther Foer, in writing about her parents, primarily her father, but also her mother, in pre-Holocaust and Holocaust-era Ukraine, is not following in the footsteps of her elders in the Safran clan, but rather she is following in the footsteps of her own son, Jonathan Safran Foer, whose book, Everything is Illuminated, was about the story of her family and of her father. She set out to try to discover, to uncover the very secrets that Jonathan was trying to uncover, to try to crack the mystery that he had tried to crack. I think you'll hear her.
Esther is now on, just wanted to let you know. So sorry to interrupt you.
Okay.
I have to say, Robert, you're doing a wonderful job. Go with it.
I think I had just said that earlier that the title of your book is I Want You to Know That We're Still Here. And I asked if you were still here, and unfortunately, there you are. So this is a story. We were talking about family secrets. When you wanted to solve a family mystery to you, something that had been gnawing at you for years, I want you to describe what it was. What was the question in your mind that you were trying to answer by going everywhere to Brazil and Ukraine and wherever else?
It was probably more than one question, because my life was full of questions, because I grew up in a family of Holocaust survivors. You didn't talk about anything. So there were lots of questions and lots of ghosts, if you will, that were always part of my life. But when I was in my 40s, suddenly a new ghost appeared. My mother casually, and this is the way we learned family secrets, they would just casually slip out. Mm-hmm. And my mother, just in a casual conversation, said, you know, your father's first wife and daughter were killed while he was on a work detail. And it just caught me totally off guard. I was dazed. I said, what? You know, here I am, a mother of three, a grown woman, and you're telling me now for the first time that I had a half sister who was killed in the Holocaust. So this new ghost took on a larger, I was going to say larger than life, but of course none of it was life, a larger space and a bigger mystery to solve. While there were all these secrets and I had all these relatives who were killed in the Holocaust, and I want to say murdered because they were murdered, suddenly there was a half sister, the person who was closest to me, and nobody knew her name. Nobody could tell me anything about her. At one point, I heard from one of my father's cousins, his closest, a first cousin who he was very close to, he said, there were so many babies that were murdered. We can't remember the names of all of them. But I needed to know something about this child who was my half sister.
To find that out, you had to cross barriers, not just geographic barriers, but barriers of language, of time, of forgetfulness, unwilling and sometimes willing forgetfulness,
Right.
and of custom, and just give people a sense of how you organized this task to find out that and other secrets.
So organized is probably the wrong word. My whole approach to life is kind of to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. So I'm not one of these people who systematically does things. Mm-hmm. I'm more of a creative spirit than a linear thinker. But every place I went, things would crop up and I would seize the opportunities. When I was in Brazil and met my father's partners who were in this money-changing business with him in Lodz, Poland, that masqueraded as a deli or a bar, they would tell me things and I would start filing them away, and the pieces started to add up to a story. And I had, and of course, the big breakthrough was Jonathan's novel, which was total fiction. Mm-hmm. And people started to come to me and say, well, you know, none of this is true. And I said, well, of course it's not true. It's a novel. But the shtetl that my father's family came from was totally destroyed. And I think sometimes when things are totally destroyed, they become bigger than life. And the descendants of this place were desperate to preserve their precious memories. And what Jonathan did in his book did not fit their precious memories. So they started to call me and say, but this is what really happened, and this is the real place, and these are the real names. And it just reached the point where I had so many of these pieces that it was time to move forward.
I was really struck as you learned more and more about that shtetl and the other shtetl and this shtetl, how different life was for, in my case, that would have been my grandparents' generation before they came to this country. I mean, places where people didn't necessarily know everyone else's name, but they knew everyone's nickname. Places where every Jew in town was either the cousin or the in-law or both of every other Jew in town. And a completely, just a completely different world you were trying to penetrate. And I can imagine there's a risk of bringing all sorts of modern or American assumptions to that situation that just won't fit.
Of course, I started with modern assumptions. For example, I was looking for information about my father, and I would ask people if they knew Louis Safran or Label Safran, which was his Yiddish name. And of course they didn't, because that's not what he called them. They called him. It's not what they called anybody. It's so-and-so would be, well, in my father's case, it was Label from Lisht, the little village he was living in. But everybody had a very descriptive nickname, some not always flattering. But it was a different world. And when I went back in 2009 with my oldest son, our oldest son, Frank Burt, sitting here, so I have to say our oldest son. I went back to a place that hadn't changed from the time my mother was born there in 1920. There were still outhouses. There was still no running water in these tiny villages. The stoves were wood burning. It was, I really went back in time, and back in the time that my family lived there.
You had also, you knew that both of your parents obviously survived the Holocaust. Every survival story is in some way a remarkable story because it was not what was intended for them. It was every such story is a great exception. And in your father's case, you're armed with a photograph, yes,
Right.
of the family, the Ukrainian, or you assumed or knew it was the Ukrainian family that had somehow sheltered him and helped him survive. This is one of the big mysteries you're trying to uncover.
Exactly. While we had little information, I grew up with this picture, and it's a small picture, and it's actually now kind of rumpled. It had survived a lot of time in a lot of places. It was the picture I gave Jonathan when he was going to Ukraine. In fact, I made 40 copies of it because as I say in the book, my mother did everything sparingly, and I do everything to a little bit of excess. And she would always remind me of that. So I made these 40 copies. He took them around. He didn't find anything. But I will tell you a funny story. He got stopped at some place by a Ukrainian policeman, and they were searching his things. And here he has 40 copies of this picture. And they're like, what is this? And he's trying to explain it to them. And he was afraid that he wouldn't get out of Ukraine because of what his mother did to him. But I had this picture, and my mother, in fact, had met the man in the picture whose house my father hid in. He came to see my father in Lutsk after my father survived the war. And they were good friends. He wanted him to come back. But that's all I had. The back of the picture had some writing on it. And I showed it to people. I thought maybe it was an address. Nobody could identify it as an address. There was a scribbling on the back that looked something like Augustine, which is how Jonathan names the character in his book and subsequently the movie Augustine. There was no Augustine. That was another piece of fiction. But, as you know, when I made the decision to ultimately go to Ukraine, I talked to a mutual friend of ours, John Cuneo. I had at this point hired a researcher in Ukraine who thought maybe she'd found the family, sent me pictures, and I wasn't sure if the pictures were identical. And John says, I know a great former FBI agent you can visit. And I thought, well, I've been to Brazil, I've been to Israel, I'm going to Ukraine. I might as well hire this FBI agent. And I did. I didn't get anything definitive out of him. He said, I can't tell you that this is them. And he was the top forensic FBI agent, photographic FBI agent in the Bureau. But he said, I can't tell you it's not. And then he gave me some clues. He said, when you go there, start looking at the distance between features. Look at the pictures that are taken at the exact same angle. And then the big clue was, and he said, look at what they're wearing, because there's people with big wardrobes, and you'll likely see them in the same clothes.
One of the questions that this arises, and you address, is that Ukrainian-Jewish relations at all times are complex and difficult, to say the least. In that part of the world where many villages were simply wiped out by the Einsatz group, and before they weren't deported to camps, they were simply killed and left in mass graves. Quite often there were local people who volunteered to help, or they might have been Red Army soldiers, captured POWs who were at least allowed to live if they took part in it, whichever. How would you describe, as best you've been able to figure out the relationship between Ukrainians and Jews in the village that your father knew, which were at least good enough for him to be that close to a family that could save him?
he was in a tiny village. There were only a handful of families, and therefore only a handful of Jewish families. An old woman that I met in that village who recognized my father, who was able to tell me that he had been hiding in this house, she said, you know, I remember, she said, a lot of people in the village learned Yiddish in order to talk, you know, they were communicating with the Jews. You know, of course, Ukraine now has a Jewish president, so
Yes.
got to keep that in perspective. The people that I met and tried to talk to about anti-Semitism, about the situation in modern Ukraine, or the Holocaust, really didn't talk much about that. They called it the problem.
Hmm.
It was hard to really dig deep, and in some ways, I didn't want to. I was in search of this information. I was trying to put my history together.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to delve too deeply into politics.
You describe at one point when you're in Ukraine going to Trochenbrod, a Ukrainian shtetl that really doesn't exist anymore, and it's just it's gone to seed, literally. And this is where you thought that your father came from, and you're with a group and a guide going to the spot in the forest where the Jews of Trochenbrod had been taken in trucks by the Germans and then executed and left in mass graves. And the guide is retelling the story, and you write, we knew this story already, of course, and yet with each recounting, history was turning into memory and memory into history. I'd like you to talk about that.
I mean, one of the things that really crystallized for me as I was writing, and also I was reading Jewish text, Jewish attitudes towards memory, and the idea that we Jews are a people of memory became so clear to me. So many scholars have written about this, that there is actually no word in modern Hebrew or in ancient Hebrew for history. The word is memory. Now they do have a word for history, but it's taken from English, which was taken from Greek. That when you read the Bible, it's individual stories about memories of these families and that we learn from. When we celebrate Passover, it's not a story of this happened when, and this is what the sea looked like and how deep it was. We're supposed to see ourselves. We're going through the desert. We're supposed to be reliving it. And I realized how important these memories and these stories are. I write in the book that history is studying about the end of something, but memory is the beginning of something. It's something, in this case, it's something I can pass on to my children and they can pass on to their children. And originally, that's why I undertook this task. I wanted my children, I realized my mother she was old, she was living with us, that if these stories were going to be preserved, I had to do it. So I'm deeply committed to the idea of family memories, of other people memorializing or somehow capturing their family memories.
I suspect that one of the hardest things for younger people, by which I mean people younger than we are, to get about Holocaust survivors in this age when people speak of owning one's own narrative, in a time when authenticity has been celebrated as a vital piece of one's integrity, when storytelling has been celebrated as such an important activity. I think the silence of Holocaust survivors when they came either to DP camps in Europe or to the United States and later, it must be hard for people to grasp. As you mentioned, your mother talked very little about this and just let drop one day that your father, who by that time had died, I guess, had an earlier marriage, a wife and a child, both of whom were lost. How do you understand the the lack of bearing witness in the late 1940s and 50s. I would say it went on even longer than that.
Yeah, well, I think there are lots of different elements to it, if, in the case of Holocaust survivors. First of all, I mean, their history, their memories were so scarred that when the war was over, this remnant, and there were maybe 300,000 survivors and 6 million Jews who had been killed, they wanted to move forward. And sometimes the way to move forward is to put that past behind you. And as I write in the book, the DP camps where we lived for several years had the highest birth rate of any place in the world. People were trying to build new lives, and sometimes you had to block that out. And I also know that when we came to the United States, people didn't really want to hear, whether it was guilt that they didn't do enough, whether it was fear of hearing about the atrocities from people who saw it firsthand. But again, in the United States, people were told, you know, it's time to move on. Forget about that. Of course, you can't forget about that.
One of the mysteries that you set out to solve in this story was the story behind what you describe at the very beginning of the book. In the first couple of sentences, you write, "My birth certificate says that I was born on September 8, 1946 in Siegenheim, Germany. It's the wrong date, wrong city, wrong country." You write that it took you years to understand why, if that was your birthday, why your mother would give you a birthday kiss every year on March 17th.
Right.
So now you understand at least why you had a fake birthday. Tell us the story.
So one of the things about writing this book was the opportunity to actually take my memories and to delve into history. It gave me the opportunity to understand what was going on in those villages, what timelines were, why we escaped from Poland into Germany secretly in a flatbed truck that was where we were hidden because we were sneaking in under the Iron Curtain. And it helped me understand why Jews weren't wanted anywhere in the world after the war. There are these 300,000 people approximately who had nowhere to go. Palestine was closed. The United States didn't want Jews. There had already been anti-Semitic quotas in the 20s, but there was pressure now that there were these refugees and what happens to them, and there was pressure on the US government and other governments too, to find a place for them because going back to their villages was just not an option. And in fact, the US government passed the 1948 DP Immigration Act. And reading about it and reading the restrictions, it was blatantly anti-Semitic. It was to allow 200,000 displaced persons into the United States. At the end of the day, only 80,000 who came under that act were Jews, because it said you had to have been in Germany by December of 1945. Well, most Jewish survivors had gone east. That's how they survived. There wasn't enough time to come back, to go to Germany by December of 45. And for my family, I was born in Poland after December of 45. So if my parents had said that, it would have been clear they weren't in the right place. So there were lots of falsified documents. I have a notebook with documents where you see smudged numbers, you know, all the things.
One of the ways of getting treated favorably under the Displaced Persons Act, you write, was to be a farmer. And so your father, who, as you describe, made a living ostensibly through running a deli in Poland, but actually doing some black market money changing, got certified as a farmer in Germany. Somehow he found some bureaucrat willing to declare that he was a farmer.
First-class farmer, by the way.
First-class farmer, yes.
That's very important. So I suspect there were other documents that were manipulated besides my birth certificate in order to qualify to meet these quotas. Fortunately, my parents knew how to do that and knew how to work the system. Some people didn't. We were lucky, but the quotas
But
were.
Esther, when you discovered that you were, as the French would say, a dreamer avant la lettre, but before we had that phrase, that in fact your parents had gotten in under some creative methods. Did you give a thought? Did you give a thought to saying, well,
You were that.
I can't write about the illicit terms of my father's application for qualifying under the Displaced Persons Act, but let's not write it. But did you just discuss that at all, about not writing it?
Did I discuss it? Well, you know that I'm married to a lawyer.
Yes,
Who
I know that. Yes.
really walks a very straight line, unlike my family when they came. It actually all came to a head. I was speaking at Addis Israel, our synagogue, and the rabbi's husband, who is a great lawyer, heard I was going to do this, and he knew my situation. He said, "You cannot talk about this publicly until you've checked with some immigration lawyers to understand what your risks are." So a friend of ours, actually, who was in the Obama administration, who was head of immigration policy, set me up with, see, we came out of the shtetl and now we know people. He set me up with the guy who was head of the U.S. Immigration Lawyers Association. And we had a great call. But he started, I wrote him my story, and he said, "I can't tell you that that anything's going to happen, but I also can't tell you that you're not at risk." And those of you who read the papers may know that Donald Trump has set up a denaturalization task force to denaturalize Americans or citizens if they so desire and if they find reasons to. So of course my husband said to me, he said, "Okay, that's the story. You cannot start the book this way." And I'll say, in this day and age, when we're looking at these children who are being held in Texas, and people who came here the same way I did, as young children who are potentially candidates for deportation, I felt I had to say that. So what will happen? I don't know. I mean, my husband keeps saying, he says, "No, you're giving them all the evidence."
Well, Esther, you froze there for a moment, but yes, you've been you have the benefit of counsel and right at home, and so far no loud knocks on the door in the middle of the night, no raids by La Migra to get you. Before we turn over to the questions from people who've been listening and watching, I just wanted you to conclude with the story of your father's survival and the photograph and the family they put up. How clear a picture do you have of how your father, who was lucky enough to be sent off on a work detail to fix some windows by the occupying Germans, and therefore was not there when his wife and your half sister, his young daughter, who was not a baby at all, they'd been married a while,
5 years old.
they're all killed. How did he survive? Who were his protectors, and how did he escape being killed in all those years?
So there's so much I don't know, and so much I will never know. I've put the pieces together that have given me enough truth to move forward, to be comfortable. I will never know. One of his partners in this money-changing business in Lodz told me that my father went all the way to Moscow, crossing enemy lines. Is that true? I don't know if that's even possible. I know that he was hidden by this family for some part of the war. The descendants of the man who hid him believe he was only there for a few months. But it's a story we'll never know. So today I was listening to, as I was going for my morning walk, I was listening to TED Talks, and I was listening to Isabel Allende. And she said there's this Jewish expression about what's truer than truth. She says, the story. So I now have my story, and that I'll never know all the truths, but I'm grateful for having had the opportunity to put as much together as I did. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been able to write it, which was an important process for me. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to share it with all of you.
And I should remind people that the title of the book is I Want You to Know We're Still Here, a shout out to those people who lost their lives back then. And I'm sure that people who are here, I know that they have lots of questions because periodically they flash across my screen, and I'm not deft enough at Zoom to pick up on them. So I'm going to hand over now to Suzanne Borden for a moment, who has been fielding the questions and can see them. And Suzanne?
Yep, great. Thank you. Thank you both. Esther, the story is just absolutely fascinating and inspiring. So yes, if anybody has questions, if you could please put it in the Q&A box, that would be great. We'll start off with a few now. What was it like finding out about your father's wife and daughter? And why do you suppose your mother finally decided to tell you at that moment in time?
Oh, I think it just slipped out. She didn't decide to tell me. There was so much that she didn't tell me. What was interesting is that she was more willing to talk to her grandchildren than to me. That somehow that's a different relationship. And it's kind of classic amongst Holocaust survivor families that that a survivor didn't want to inflict pain on their own children. And of course, I was sensitive to not asking too many questions, to maneuvering around tough subjects, because I didn't want to inflict more pain on this woman who had suffered so much. So it just slipped out. But when she talked to her grandchildren, it was about her immortality. And today I just watched a beautiful video that one of my granddaughters sent me, Passover, maybe 3-4 years ago. Shortly before my mother died, we decided to focus on her exodus to freedom. And the grandchildren asked her questions. And apparently one of them taped it and sent it to me today. And it's really quite beautiful. And she loved telling them the stories that she didn't want to tell me. But she told what she wanted to tell and didn't tell what she didn't want to tell.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. How did you decide on the title of your book? I Want You to Know We're Still Here.
It was a tough choice. It was a tough decision. I knew that I've read enough Holocaust memoirs, and there are plenty of them out there, and there are so many stories to tell. But somehow as I was writing, it was clear to me that I wanted to imbue this story with life and more life. It's who I am, and that was important to me. When I went to Ukraine in 2009, I decided I wanted to leave something behind. But, where am I leaving it? In the dirt roads of Ukraine, in the mass graves of my family. But somehow, symbolically, that was important to me. And I decided on our annual Rosh Hashanah card. We do a card every year. It has all of our family on it. In 2018, before my mother died, there were 14 of us. And I somehow wanted symbolically, it was like burying something in the Western Wall. I brought these pictures with me and buried them in each mass grave. And in a way, who am I talking to? But I wanted to somehow say to my grandmothers, you don't know it, but you have descendants, and lots of them. And I want you to know we're still here. So after much thinking about calling it more life or other things, I decided to go with I want you to know we're still here, which is an important message for me of the book.
Absolutely. That's really a beautiful story. And it shows why the title is so meaningful. Where do you think that sense of responsibility to carry on the stories of your family come from? I know in the book you talked about, I think it was a cousin who you came and stayed, the family, and the boy had passed away, but you've really taken it on as to share that story.
Right, right. It turns out that we came here in 1949, and I had a cousin who was just about my age who died shortly before we came in a routine tonsillectomy. And he was the only descendant of the family that welcomed us. And I feel a responsibility to also keep his memory alive.
Thank you.
Who's going to do it?
A lot of people are asking some tips. You know, you had you were able to travel, but for folks who can't travel, where do they start? There's so many different search engines and websites, and where can people begin?
So I used a lot of those search engines, a lot of those websites, but I think you start with people. The library that is going to go away when they die. You start by talking to the oldest people you can, by talking to the most important clues I got were in conversations. I wish I'd asked more questions when I could have. I didn't, but I'm so grateful for what I did ask. The search engines are going to be there, the people aren't, so that's where I would start.
When you were in Ukraine, did you speak Ukrainian or Russian? How did you communicate with people?
None of the above. In doing this search, I ended up hiring people to help me. And in Ukraine, I had a young woman who I interviewed several there were some professional genealogical experts in Ukraine that understand Jewish genealogy, and I interviewed several of them. But I ultimately went with a young woman who had done some work for a friend of mine, who wasn't an expert, but she was really committed to the story. And she, before I actually went to Ukraine, she went ahead and did, what's the term I'm looking, advanced work. You know, like you do for a candidate. She went and did advanced work. She found the oldest people in town to make sure that I could be able to talk to them. So that's how I did it. She was my translator.
You know, Suzanne, may I interrupt?
Yeah, absolutely.
In reading the story, I knew exactly what this person was. Reporters on road trips retain a fixer. And the fixer is part interpreter and booker, and doing advanced pre-interviews. And you had was this Anna? You had a terrific fixer. And reading it, any journalist heading, if there were any reason to do a story in that part of Ukraine, they would want to find Anna to use to hire her.
The interesting thing about Anna is that every important woman who had stories for me was an Anna.
Yes.
That was Anna the fixer, and it made all the difference. And anybody who's going to take a trip like this, hire a fixer and have them do advanced work.
Well, besides the fixer, the FBI forensic person that you hired, what other tips? You mentioned that he gave you some tips in terms of looking at photographs, and any other advice that would be useful for people?
That I found from the FBI agent?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The best piece of advice he gave me, I thought the pictures looked similar, but I was skeptical about the whole thing. I mean, here, this many years after the Holocaust, I was going to find these people because I had a little tiny picture. In fact, when we arrived in Ukraine, in Lvov, my son Frank said to Anna the fixer, "So you really think it's these people?" And she said 90%. And he said, "Why 90%? She said, "Because the last 10% is up to you." And when we were in their house, we had this amazing moment where it was all coming together. And I looked at Frank and I said, "This can't be true. Is this really true?" And Frank said 110%. But the FBI agent, the biggest clue he gave me was to look at clothes. And he was absolutely right. These people don't have huge wardrobes. And that was
the implication there was that if there was a picture of somebody wearing the same clothes, then those were the clothes you put on for a photograph,
Right.
and you could identify somebody that way.
Somebody would like to know if there is a Yitzker book for your father's ancestral town.
For Trochenbrod, there is. Trochenbrod, which was this 1,500 people, and a totally Jewish settlement, except for the postmaster, who by law had to be Christian, had to be Polish, I guess pure Polish Christian. But this little town, and maybe because it was completely destroyed, has this large group of survivors and descendants who come together. They have a building right outside of Tel Aviv. Somebody had the forethought, I think it was after the war, somebody had made some money and said, look, I'll give you the money to buy a little piece of land. They built a building. And what happened is that the building now throws off income. And so with the income, they're able to publish a Yitzker book. They're able to take these trips. Israelis go back on these trips to Trochenbrod every couple of years, and it's a subsidized trip for them. So they have this building, and they go there, and they have reunions. It's really an amazing thing. It's probably a stronger Landsman kind of connection than certainly anything else I've heard of.
Thank you. You have said that you grew up surrounded by ghosts. Do you now feel these ghosts have finally been laid to rest?
I think they have found a place. They have found a place in the pages of my book. And I am much more at peace. They're not with me at night anymore. They're in the book. So have they been laid to rest? Not totally. I hope they will be there for future readers and for my descendants.
Mm-hmm. And do your sons feel that same responsibility to keep on the legacy of your family?
So I have to say my grandchildren feel that responsibility. Our oldest granddaughter, who in some ways inspired a lot of the work, who would sit in my office and look at the boxes that were labeled by family units, but pictures not necessarily labeled. One day said to me, so Grandma, how will I know who these people are? And she announced, she's 15 now, not too long ago, she said, I'm going to be the family historian. So I think I've given them that gift, not only of this story, but of how to carry on the story, not only of our family, but the other sides of their family. And it's also the gift of understanding that something terrible happened and the family made it. They knew my mother, they understood her strength, and they understand things will happen. And families have a lot and then lose it, or in our case, get wiped. Most of them get wiped out, but somebody survives. And it's there's been a study done at the university at Emory by actually a Jewish professor about how important telling these stories is for children. That it's the most, I guess, significant element of making them understand their resilience.
Mm-hmm. And I would also say, with so many survivors now gone, to be able for your book is so important because it allows people to hear from you when and in the future when there are no survivors left. They need to hear these stories. Someone would like to know, speaking of the photographs, any suggestions if someone has lots of photographs but there's nothing written on the back of them? How do they start?
Wow. I happen to be particularly good, maybe because of what happened, because my family tree was cut off to the stump. I can look at people and see relationships. I can even do this in my husband's family. I can look at an old picture and go, oh, that's your great grandmother. And I can see the facial features. But I'm not sure how to tell it. Again, talk to people. At one point, on my husband's side of the family, I sent pictures to his great aunt, and she would label them for me. I sent pictures to people who were no longer alive, but now I've labeled them. Have I done a good enough job? No, that's the next project.
It's a good lesson to all of us, as we all have rolls and rolls of pictures on our cameras, the importance of printing them and documenting them so that people can know who we are when we're gone. I think we are going to take just one or two more questions if anybody else wants to chime in. Robert, I don't know if you have any more questions you'd like to ask.
No, let me hear what questions you have from others, and then.
Okay. So how did you find out about the Landman descendant group from your father's shtetl?
How did I find out about which descendant?
The Landsman group.
Oh, the Landsman group. Okay.
The Landslide Society, not Landslide Society.
They are. How did I find? Yes, because from somebody in the United States, one of those people who called me to tell me what was wrong with the story that my son wrote, our son wrote, who said, I know all the information, and by the way, there's this group in Israel. They even have a website. They sent out notices all the time. It was really by talking to people. It wasn't something that I was able to Google and find.
Okay. You talked a little bit at towards the beginning about the displaced persons camp. And I know in your book, you also go a little bit further and talk about that it took a really long time for the U.S. to intervene. And then you also mentioned how only a small amount of Jews were allowed into the United States. Why do you think this is a story that is not known by very many people?
And it isn't, and it's the thing that seems to be of interest to a lot of people when they read the book. Because there was this terrible war, and everybody wants to think that, okay, we came to the United States and everything was okay. And that period in between is just not talked about very much. It was kind of this interim period between tragedy and survival. That's not the word I'm looking for. Revival. That's the word. It's not talked about, but it was a period that was really important. There were these people who had nothing. And the Allied soldiers had no idea what to do with them. They originally thought, well, go home, go back to your villages. Well, of course, that wasn't an option, and there wasn't any place to go. And these survivors did not want to be pushed around by soldiers again. They wanted to control their own fate. The DP camps that were set up were sometimes awful. At least one of them was in a former concentration camp. It was so bad that President Truman he had heard stories about how bad the displaced persons camps were. And he sent the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School to do an investigative tour. And he came back and he reported to Truman that we're treating the Jews the same way the Nazis did, except we're not exterminating them. So it took, nobody knew what to do, and everybody kind of hoped it would go away, but it wouldn't. And nobody knew where to put these people, what edifices to put them in. But it is a much forgotten period, and it's an important period. And the DP camps existed well into the 1950s because people didn't have a place to go. They didn't know how to forge a birth certificate and say they were a farmer. They were following the rules, which clearly my parents didn't always do.
So, Suzanne, may I just add one note that I was very happy in reading your book, Esther, to see the name of one historian whom you turned to for some help, Timothy Snyder from Yale, whom I had the good fortune to read and interview several times when I was still at NPR. And I think that one thing that Snyder does, and that puts in context what was happening in that part of the world where your parents came from and where my grandparents came from, is that most of the literature of survival of the Holocaust that we've read comes from people from countries where your chances of survival were much greater. You were sent to a camp, and maybe you would still be alive when the liberating forces came. If you were a French Jew or a Hungarian Jew, you might be deported fairly deep into the war and have some chance of survival. That initial German offensive that just goes from one shtetl to the next, one Jewish community to the next, just mass murder, no transport to camps, left very few survivors behind.
Exactly.
And there just aren't a lot of accounts of what life was like because there just weren't a lot of people left to tell it. And Snyder has explained that, and I would, after people have read your book, they can take a much longer read through one of Tim Snyder's histories of the region. But I was happy to see he was one of your export sources.
Absolutely. And he talks about that part of the world where my family came from as the Bloodlands. It was kind of being overrun by one power or another. It's when I went to look at the shtetls, I had to do it by their coordinates, the latitude and longitude, because the names constantly changed depending on which government was in control.
Mm-hmm.
When we flew in from, we flew through Frankfurt from Dulles, and we get to Frankfurt, the airport, and Frank and I are looking for the flight to Lvov.
Mm-hmm.
We'll find it posted anywhere, because at that time in Germany, it was still called Lemberg, which is what the Germans called it.
Right.
So it's a very confusing part of the world where there were lots of, the Jews were kind of in the middle between these powers and somehow managed to survive pogroms and being overrun, which is why people like my grandparents didn't leave. They thought, okay, it's going to be tough, but we'll survive. And it's
how bad can it get?
But when you think of the Holocaust, you think of concentration camps. This wasn't 1.5 million, at least 1.5 million Jews were killed by these Einsatzgruppen in what is now Poland, Ukraine, Russia, just village by village, person by person, bullet by bullet.
Wow. Well, we're going to take one last question, and we're going to make it a little bit more, I guess, I'm not sure what I'm saying. I'm sorry. What was your favorite moment of discovery in writing the book, or your most powerful moment of discovery in doing all of this?
Well, two things, I guess. The actual finding of my half-sister's name, something I thought would never, ever happen. I went because I felt, it was time to go, and that if I was going to find anything, 2009 was getting about as late as I could go to meet people who were still alive. But I never expected to actually find her name, to find somebody who played with her, somebody who could describe her. So that was definitely the most important discovery. Totally different. The other important piece for me, which I didn't expect, was actually writing it. And the process of writing, where I was able to put those ghosts and how I was able to deal with the emotions that I had kept bottled up most of my life, was an important discovery for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther, so much for sharing your story. It's fascinating. It's inspiring. I know you encourage everybody to dig into their past and share their stories. Robert, thank you so much for being in conversation with Esther. Please,
Been a pleasure.
everybody, I want you to know that we will send you a link in a few days that not only has the video, but also a link to our website where we encourage you to purchase Esther's book. I want you to know we're still here. Esther has graciously offered to autograph any copies that are purchased. And again, thank you all for joining us. Sorry for any technical difficulties at the beginning. And please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you, Robert.